Welcome to Conversations in a Vintage Shop, a podcast from behind my counter between customers. Join me while I sit behind my retail counter and just have a conversation with you, or with myself. While I look out the window, observe what I see, things that are happening in the store today, throughout the week, and just fun little stories that I have from my time as a business owner. This is something that you find interesting, then keep listening, and I appreciate you. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Conversations in a Vintage Shop, a podcast where I bring the conversations I have with my customers in my shop here in Fargo, North Dakota, to you. Now, I apologize ahead of time. I'm a little stuffed up today. My allergies are going insane. So if my voice cuts out and I sound very plugged up, it's because I am. But today is a really special episode because if any of you listened to the previous episode, I hinted at being in another JULIEN'S auction. And I said that if I didn't win anything, you would never hear me talk about it again. And I would be sad, cowering in a corner. Well, I did win stuff. Therefore, this whole episode is going to be dedicated. It's going to be a What I Won at JULIEN'S Auctions Part 2. Now, in this auction, it was another collaboration with Classic Movies and JULIEN'S Auctions, and the theme this time around was Hollywood and royalty. Now, this was a very big auction for multiple reasons. The biggest being there were photographed and documented pieces up for auction that were owned and worn by Princess Diana. So that has been very hyped. It was really interesting to watch. And then also pieces from the estate of Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart. And their children were auctioning off presents that they gave to each other throughout their marriage. I know their wedding bands were up for auction, a necklace, cufflinks, a lot of really, really cool, beautiful items that were very personal to them. So this was going to be a very big auction. And I knew that this time around, I had to really hone in on my organizational skills in terms of what I was going to bid on. And no, I did not attempt or even want to bid on anything from Princess Diana, Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, because I don't. That would be a cost of like 5 of my houses. Or 5 of one of my house. You know what I mean. So this episode is going to be dedicated to how I did this particular auction differently and what I won. And I will say that the pieces that I won took a lot more researching than I had done in the past. And I will tell you why. So if that's something that interests you, keep listening. For this particular auction, I had to be very, very prepared because of the volume of pieces that were offered. This was a 3-day auction. It started Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And I had pieces I was looking at all 3 days. So I had to lay out and map out each day what exactly I wanted, what I was willing to bid on it, what the estimates were, and I had to rank everything that I had put on my watch list so that I knew what I could cut if I was getting to that point. So the process this time, I really had to practice restraint and first instincts, because there were pieces that I very much could have won, but I tapped out because there were pieces that I wanted more, and I needed to save up everything I could to put full force into that, because I was very prepared to put all of my eggs in one basket with this one particular item I wanted. And if I didn't get anything else, at least I would have gotten this one item. But I tell you, I was having nightmares about this particular auction and bidding on things that I didn't want and winning them, and then I didn't have any money. And I do have to say, this is a big question I get when I have people coming into the shop and viewing the items that I had purchased in prior auctions. I have a really wonderful Hollywood themed setup in the shop right now, so people can see Debbie Reynolds' MGM bra from the 50s and one of Elizabeth Taylor's coats from the late 60s, early 70s. And the biggest thing is people ask, how much did this cost? And well, if you ask me, I will tell you, I'm not going to put it all out there. You can look all of this up. This is all public record. You can look up the auctions if you're really curious of how much I paid for it. But what I tell people is that I've been collecting for years and years and years and years. If you've listened to prior episodes, I don't remember a time where I wasn't collecting vintage. And even before I opened up my shop, I would collect pieces just knowing that there was going to be a purpose for them at some point in time. I didn't know what that purpose was when I'm 16 and buying these vintage dresses or vintage statues that I loved. I knew I wouldn't have them forever, that there was a bigger purpose for them. And there are pieces that I've been collecting and holding on to for years that their purpose became very known, because if you've especially been looking at my Instagram, Facebook page, I've been selling pieces from my personal collection in preparation for this auction. And that's why. I mean, in these auctions, yes, things go for a lot of money. And I always thought that the only people that were a part of these auctions were people that had millions of dollars and were really rich. But what I'll say, and I think this is true for anybody and their passion, if you're passionate enough about it and it's something that really interests you, that you love, you will find a way to do it and make it work. And owning a piece from Elizabeth Taylor has been my dream since childhood. She has been my idol since I was a kid. And I had pieces that I've been collecting that I love, but they didn't feel like mine. I felt as if I could pass that on to someone. They would get something, I would get something. So I sold a good amount of pieces from my collection to raise money for this, and I've been saving for this for a while. So this isn't just money I had sitting in my back pocket. I made a conscious decision to sell pieces that I love and have collected because I saw the bigger picture. So if any of these auctions do interest you, it's not unattainable. It takes planning, and it takes a lot of saving and sacrificing pieces that you love for the bigger prize, if you will. Now, I wrote down a bunch of notes on what I was going to talk to today, and they're kind of all over the place because, like I said, this particular auction took a lot more research than I had in any other auction. And there it almost felt like I was back in college writing a research paper, and I think that was the part that was my favorite, and I'm still researching some pieces. I've yet to receive any of these. I do not physically have them in my hands. With Julien's auctions, you pay after the entire auction is done, and it can take up to 6 to 8 weeks for you to get your winnings. So I don't physically have them in my hands yet. Hopefully, maybe by the time you hear this episode, I will, but you better believe I'll be sharing it on social media when I do. But I was just jotting notes about the whole process the entire time. And really, the biggest thing I wrote down is how much anxiety I felt towards this particular one. And the reason why is there was a piece, and I will say this, I did not win this piece. But there was a piece that held a lot of sentimental value to me that was causing me a lot of stress. And this was a piece from the namesake of my shop, Rita Hayworth. With Rita Hayworth, again, she's the namesake of my shop. I have loved her since my youth. Not as long as Elizabeth Taylor, though. But I loved her story, her struggles. She was a redhead. I mean, there's so many things. If you don't know anything about Rita Hayworth, she made a lot of really wonderful films. My favorite was CoverGirl. Of course, there's Gilda, which is what she was known for. Stephen King, when he wrote The Shawshank Redemption, the actual title is Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption, because she was a very famous pinup. She was used in World War II to boost morale. Her image was. And she was married to Orson Welles, struggled with a lot of mental health issues. She is a very big example of the Hollywood machine and how they, even now, but especially back then, whitewashed non-white actors to be more white. They used electrolysis and lasers to push back her hairline, cosmetic surgery to, and this is a quote, make her look less ethnic. So her story is very painful to read, but worth it. And I tell you, she is definitely an actress that I feel like does not get her due. And I've always just been enamored with her and how she lights up a screen. People say Marilyn Monroe does, Rita Hayworth does. She's amazing. Really an amazing woman and story. But in this auction, it came up one of her blouses that she wore playing the title character in the film Miss Sadie Thompson, released by Columbia in 1953. Now, this one had specific provenance because there's a picture of her wearing it in a film still on the cover of Picture Show magazine, as well as a letter. Now, this piece was actually used as promotional material when the movie was released. Fans would write in and get a chance to win actual items from this film to promote it. So this piece was won by a fan who wrote in a letter. They got a letter back, they got the blouse, and they got the magazine with her wearing it. Now, this piece, again, I really wanted it because it was Rita Hayworth, and her pieces do not come up for auction very often, especially photos of her wearing it. So I knew this piece was going to go for, I mean, it could have gone for a lot more than it did. But because it's a movie that isn't as well known, I knew it could be kind of a crapshoot. So this was one I was struggling with because I really thought it would be amazing to have this piece in the shop. She's the namesake. She's the reason why I embraced having red hair. And even though she was forced to have red hair, I get it. There's a whole story. But I just love her so much. However, I have never seen that movie, ever. So my connection to it wasn't as strong. And I kept telling myself, yes, it's a Rita Hayworth piece, but it's also a movie of hers I've never seen, and it just didn't feel right at that moment. So that was a piece that I ended up letting go. And I'm looking at, this is my ADHD kicking in. I'm looking at the description on the JULIEN'S website about this blouse, and they called her Rita Hayward. So someone had a typo in their description. I just noticed that now. But this one had an estimate between $1,000 and $2,000. I did bid, but I tapped out pretty early, and it sold for $1,950. Now, that's not just the selling price. They do add on, I believe it's a 30% buyer's premium. You have other fees added onto it. So this did end up going for over $2,000. Now, obviously, that was just not going to be doable for me, so I had to pass. But one day, I hope to own something, even little, from Rita Hayworth and have it honored in the shop where I have her picture hanging near the front. So now moving on to the pieces that I did win. So I had a long list, and I'm going to pull my list up right now, because I had written out everything in day 1, day 2, day 3 that I wanted, what the lot numbers were, what the anticipated selling point was going to be. Now there were, 1,416 items in this auction. And I remember, what was it? They start at noon our time, Central Standard Time. And I think I got off of one of them at maybe 6:30 is when I kind of backed out. But the first day, they had a lot of miscellaneous Hollywood items. I believe that was the first day of the Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall auction. And there was only one thing I had my eye on. I whittled a lot of things down, but in the 90s, Sigourney Weaver was in an adaptation of Snow White called Snow White, A Tale of Terror. And it had Sigourney Weaver, and it starred Monica Keena. Now, if you don't know who Monica Keena is, those of us who grew up in the 90s, early 2000s, definitely more of an indie actress. She was in this movie called Strike, which was about a girls' school and the students having like a feminist rebellion. In the 2000s, she was in Freddy vs. Jason. I actually didn't mind that movie. She was in Crime and Punishment in Suburbia. And some may know her as Jen Lindley's friend in Dawson's Creek, her bad influence friend. And I loved this version of Snow White. I have it on DVD. I really loved it. But Sigourney Weaver's prosthetics as the Wicked Witch, some of the designs and some fake apples were up for auction. But that ended up going for more than I thought. So I tapped out. Now, day 2, looking at my notes, was a day where I did have a lot of pieces that I was interested in. And this one was a little bit easier to whittle down. Now, the first up was a screen-worn and promotional-worn costume that Alicia Silverstone wore in the movie Excess Baggage. It was on a film poster. She wore it in the film. It was kind of a destroyed, tattered pair of jeans and t-shirt with like this atomic rocket on it. And growing up, I loved Alicia Silverstone. Of course, I saw Clueless, but I loved her as Batgirl in, which one was that? Was that Batman and Robin? Or I don't remember. Again, I'll say this time and time again. Michael Keaton is the only Batman. Those are the only 2 films that I care about. Everything else is just a jumbled memory. But this movie, I never saw. But I remember as a kid when me and my family went to George of the Jungle at this little theater in Park Rapids, Minnesota that only showed one film. I saw a coming soon poster for this movie. And I loved Alicia Silverstone. She was wearing this outfit. And it's just a very distinct memory I have, even though I never saw the film. That one ended up going for more. So again, I tapped out. And then there were two pieces that came up from a film that has now gained cult status, but was pretty controversial when it was released in 1999. And that was the movie But I'm a Cheerleader. And it was a movie about a young girl, a young cheerleader, coming out to her family and getting sent to a conversion therapy camp. Now, it was very campy, satire, but it was a very controversial subject at that time for a lot of different reasons, but still a very relevant movie today. And I mean, gosh, what is that, 20 years later? And RuPaul was in it, Clea Duvall, Catherine Moriarty. I mean, you had a lot of really good who's who in there. Melanie Linsky, who's been getting a lot of overdue credit lately. But I loved the visuals in this movie. Everything was color blocked. It was set in the modern day, but everybody wore vintage clothing. I mean, my descriptions of this movie don't do it justice, so please watch it. You can find it. I know it's free on Tubi. You can find it free on YouTube. You can find this movie everywhere. It's great. You really should watch it. But there were several pieces that came up from that movie that were screen worn. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about provenance. And in some of these auctions, you do get the provenance, which is where it came from, who owned it, story behind it. A lot of items don't have that, but the provenance makes it inherently more valuable. And the provenance behind this was, I can't remember if it's like movie reels and props out of Los Angeles that buy out costumes from different productions, and then they'll resell them or rent them out to other movies, television productions, etc. And these pieces came from there. Now, there were two skirts worn by Natasha Lyonne, who was the lead character in that movie. And one skirt was this brown pleated cheerleader style wool skirt that I really wanted. And it was worn in the scene where she gets kicked out of conversion therapy. And I thought that would be a really cool piece to have, specifically because that scene ended up going for just a hair more than I budgeted. But I ended up getting the second one that was up for auction. And admittedly, when I bid on some of these, I read the descriptions, but I don't read them super closely. I mainly look at the provenance and the estimate. And what I found fun about this was I didn't even know what scene this particular skirt was from. And it was just a lavender, lilac-y colored nylon, like little thin sheer skirt. But then when I read more about it, I saw that it was actually 1960s Vanity Fair half slip. And I thought, that's perfect. I collect vintage lingerie. This was screen used. So it's perfect. This is great. It worked out. And this skirt was used in a scene that you saw it very briefly, but it was a scene towards the later half of the film where her and Clea Duvall are in a vintage type beauty salon in their conversion therapy camp. And the entire set is this lavender purple. And both Clea Duvall and Natasha Lyonne are wearing lavender colored vintage lingerie. And Natasha Lyonne is sitting in this lavender drying chair, getting her toenails painted by Clea Duvall, who's wearing this really adorable lavender baby doll lingerie. And Natasha Lyonne is wearing a vintage bustier, waist cincher, and this slip. And she's sitting down, so you get you don't get a full look at it, but you see the skirt in the scene. And I thought, oh, if I could get that entire outfit one day, that would be really cool. So you get about a 5-10 second shot of the skirt, but still, it's pretty cool. And I love Natasha Lyonne. For those of you who don't know her earlier work, she was in Orange is the New Black. Russian doll. You see her now in Old Navy commercials. But I loved her when I saw her in Slums of Beverly Hills with Marissa Tomei, Alan Alda. Oh, that movie is so good. So, so good. If you've never seen that movie, I highly suggest it. It's great. So I got that piece. And then more items throughout that day. There were some scripts from the show Frasier that I was looking at. Those went for a lot of money because they're doing a reboot of that. So, of course, the value goes up. But then there were a bunch of pieces from the ABC show The Goldbergs. And anybody I told about this couldn't understand why the heck I wanted anything from this show. But I love this show. I mean, I kind of stopped watching after the 4th season because I don't have cable and life gets busy. But Wendy McCovey is hilarious, and a bunch of her sweaters and clothes were up for auction. And I thought it'd be hilarious to get some. Again, those went for way more than I thought. Because the provenance was a marketing tactic for the show, that it was Beverly Goldberg's estate and auction, which was her character in the show. So I think because they used that as a promotional opportunity, that's why those pieces ended up going for more. But hey, whatever. Just had to pause and take a quick drink of my Red Bull, which I've had more Red Bull in the past 2 months than I had, I think, since college. And it kind of worries me. So that was really the end of day 2, where the Goldbergs is when I tapped out. And that was around, I think, 5 o'clock that day. But day 3 was where the big guns were happening. This is where I had a lot of pieces that I really, really wanted and was going to be the most stressful. But what I forgot, now this was for lot 840 to 1,416, so to the very end. Now, the very end chunk, I think the last 3 to 400 items were from the estate of Dennis Hopper, who is an easy rider. That was not a part of the auction I cared about, so I thought, okay, well, that'll be the end bulk. But I forgot that Princess Diana's personal effects were going up for auction, like the first chunk. And then they had a few Marilyn Monroe pieces as usual. They had some of her hairpins and receipts. So that took way longer than I expected. And I was kind of sitting on pins and needles because it was a Friday. My shop was open. I had people coming in and out while I'm just anxiously tapping my foot. So anybody who was in the shop on Friday, September 8th, before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, if I seemed edgy and distant and weird, my apologies. It wasn't you. I was right in the middle of this auction and sweating bullets. So I bestow my greatest and sincerest apologies if anybody had to deal with me on that day. So the Princess Diana auction went for a couple of hours. So I believe it was finally around 2-ish, 2:30 before we got into more of the lots that I was waiting for. And the lots I was waiting for started at number 925. And the first were a couple of pieces from Ingrid Bergman that she wore in a couple of her films. These, again, would have been wonderful pieces to own, but they went for thousands, rightfully so, especially with more attention being paid to some of her past films, including my favorite, starring Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer, Gaslight. That's where you get the term gaslight, is from this film. Wonderful film. Wonderful film. I mean, you can only imagine what it's about just based on the title. Please watch it. I believe it's either on Tubi or Amazon Prime for free. But her pieces went for thousands, so I tapped out. Would have been nice. Then lot 934 was the Rita Hayworth lot. We know how that went. So I just have my list by me. I'm just scratching things off as they go. And then lot 968 and 969 were documented and worn pieces from Diana Dors, who was dubbed the British Marilyn Monroe. Now, I know who Diana Dors is. I've seen a couple of her films. I'm not the biggest, most well-read fan of hers, but her pieces were really cool. And again, they were documented. And the lots went for a decent amount of money. However, one lot had 3 of her gowns in them. And I think it went for like $2,000, which is a lot, but for what you were getting, it was kind of a drop in the bucket. So that was another thing crossed off my list. But then we enter in to the territory I love best, and that were personal effects from Elizabeth Taylor. And this was where I held a lot of my eggs for this particular basket. Now, her lot went from 974 to 1020. And I had a long list of items that I had ranked that I was going to go for. Now, the top 2 items I wanted from her were 2 pieces of her lingerie. Again, I don't have to state how much I love vintage lingerie, but vintage lingerie that was owned and worn by Elizabeth Taylor really felt like a no-brainer. So those pieces were my number one. But of course, those were a little bit later down in the auction. Well, not too much later down. Yeah, those were items 1003, 1004, and we started at 974. But then another top one I really wanted was this really beautiful white creamy blazer from Issey Miyake, who recently passed away, really great prolific designer. And I thought, okay, well, the fashion history behind this and the designer would be really great. It was owned and worn by Elizabeth Taylor, equally as great. I had, what else did I write down? She had a lot of, I know when I was talking to my mom, very basic ready-to-wear pieces. There were a good amount of blazers and skirts and items from Anne Klein, which is a brand that you can still buy today. Very accessible. And I think it just shows how Elizabeth Taylor, she just loved pieces that she loved. They didn't have to be exorbitantly expensive. She just really had to think they were beautiful. And you especially see that when you hear her talk about her jewelry collection, where there's some pieces where they're costume pieces, but she just thought they were so beautiful and they didn't have to be, the Taylor Burton diamond or the Taj Mahal diamond for her to love them. They just had to be beautiful and mean something to her. And part of this collection that was auctioned off were pieces that she collaborated with Avon. Some of her Avon pieces, which have actually been going for hundreds of dollars just on a regular auction day, let alone something that she personally owned. The significance of this particular auction and the provenance behind it was another factor that really made me keen to get pieces from this particular section. And it's because all of these pieces came from the collection of Georgette Stroom. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, but she was Elizabeth Taylor's personal assistant and stylist from 1984 to 1993. Now, I know a lot about Elizabeth Taylor, but admittedly, a lot of the biographies you read about her, documentaries you read about her, don't necessarily reflect her dictation of her life. It's others' interpretations. So you never really got to see or hear about how she was behind the scenes. And so when I wanted to research more about this, I found an amazing book that was actually released in December of 2022. And it's Elizabeth Taylor, The Grit and Glamour of an Icon by Kate Anderson Brower. And this was the first authorized biography, Elizabeth Taylor. Now, this was published after her passing, but she was able to obtain personal letters, photographs, private thoughts, poems that she wrote to Richard Burton and the loves of her life and her kids. And they interviewed all people who worked for her, interviewed her children, interviewed those who loved and knew her best. And in this particular book, Georgette Stroom was recorded and referred to on her memories of Elizabeth Taylor multiple times. And I thought that would be a great place to start with my research and why these pieces are so significant. And the one thing that the book really wanted to show about Elizabeth Taylor is that those that worked for her were her family. She cared for them. She cared about them. You were her family if you worked for her, and she could trust you. She had a lot of people in her orbit that were not trustworthy. You see that with celebrities today. My first thought is Britney Spears, where you get people in your inner circle that are not looking out for your best interests and are looking out for themselves and will sell you and just profit and monetize you. So the fact that Georgette worked for her from 1984 to 1993, I think really does show that this was a great working relationship. Now, Georgette Stroom is an artist who makes beautiful like tiaras and mass sculptures, a really great artist in her own right. Now, a little background about Georgette. She started at the age of 21 working for famed two-time Oscar-winning costume designer Helen Rose. And it stated that Helen Rose had retired at this point, but she spent the majority of her career designing costumes for MGM. She did Father of the Bride, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. She designed the wedding dress for Grace Kelly, and also Elizabeth Taylor's bridal gown for her first marriage to Conrad Nicky Hilton. And yes, a relation to Paris and Nicky Hilton. And from there, she stated that she went on to work as an assistant for Nolan Miller, who did Dynasty, Hotel, Love Boat, and he was one of her in-house models because she fit Joan Collins's costumes. She fit a lot of Elizabeth Taylor's old costumes from MGM. And from there, she started working part-time with Elizabeth Taylor. Now, if you go to her website, it's Georgette, Georgett.com. And she said, while still working full-time for Nolan Miller, I started working for Elizabeth Taylor on the weekends. Initially, she hired me to go through her many clothes, edit them, and organize what was left. I began wardrobe shopping for her by helping her get dressed for special events and styling her for photographs and commercials. Eventually, I left my job with Nolan and went to work with Elizabeth full-time as her personal assistant and stylist. Working with her was an amazing adventure. I traveled all over the world, attended iconic events, met many incredible people, and had more fun than I could ever describe. Now, at the time, she was still making what she calls wearable art, clothing, tiaras, bridal headpieces, over-the-top hats, and truly they are wearable works of art, which is my favorite. And it said that while traveling, she collected fabric, trim, beads, feathers, and she created a lot of pieces for Elizabeth Taylor, including one-of-a-kind caftans, nightgowns, robes, Halloween costumes. So she really did know Elizabeth Taylor and helped Elizabeth Taylor navigate through certain times in her life. Now, just to round out a little bit more about her, because I find her really fascinating. She said, aside from my work with Helen Rose, Nolan Miller, and Elizabeth Taylor, I created and sold a retail line of loungewear and caftans. Several of my loungewear designs were worn by Elizabeth Taylor in ads for Elizabeth Taylor's Passion, which was her first perfume line. Her most recognizable and best-selling one, even best-selling, I believe, to this day, White Diamonds. She was featured in the 1989 book California Design, In 92, 93, she was a contributing editor to Harper's Bazaar magazine. And in 2009, she was inducted into the Seaside High School Hall of Fame for both her student and career achievements, which isn't that a cool full circle moment? So I thought that was really fascinating that these were pieces that Elizabeth Taylor gave to her. It was very personal. She kept these and recently decided that she would start to sell some of them. And I did get 2 pieces, technically 3, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. I do have to say that you might now hear a little bit of my shop music in the background because, again, I'm recording this in the store, so please don't mind that. I have it on my Cake Pandora station, which has been very popular lately and great trip down memory lane. So now, what did I win from the collection of Georgette Stroom, personal assistant to Elizabeth Taylor? Now, the first may not seem like much to others, but to me, any piece that came from her is meaningful. And the first was a blazer from, I believe it to be the 1980s, maybe early 1990s. And it is a bright yellow and black trimmed blazer from French couturier designer Louis Farreau. And he was best known for dressing the wardrobe of Brigitte Bardot in many of her films. And this blazer is very sleek. It's cool. I mean, if it were my size and not owned by Elizabeth Taylor, I would happily wear it. And it's a beautiful cut. I love the little details, the hanger chain that's on the back neck. It's just beautiful. You can definitely tell this was made by someone who knew how to design, especially for a woman's body. So that was the first item that I got. And the second was one of the top items I was really tripping over myself to get. And that was one of the 2 peignoir sets owned and worn by Elizabeth Taylor. And the first one that came up, beautiful, like blushy pink nightgown and outer robe set by bespoke lingerie designer Jewel Park, which I'll get into the history of her and her line in a little bit. And I was really nervous because it was me and one other bidder who were going back and forth. And I eventually tapped out once this bidding got upwards of $2,000. Because again, that was just a little too much. And I tapped out because I knew there was one left. And I was hoping that this bidder, who I'm assuming probably bid on the next set, would have a little less funds to work with. So the next peignoir set was another one from Jewel Park, and I estimate these to be from the 70s. And it is in a beautiful purple shade with embroidered flowers, billowy sleeves, robe, nightdress, and it was in her favorite color, purple. Myth says that her eyes were a mystical lilac, lavender purple, which it said that they really were more of a bluish gray. But I thought, well, okay, this is one of her most favorite colors, and I'm just gonna go all out for it. And I ended up winning. And the moment the hammer fell, or gavel fell, all of the anxiety and stress that had been built up in my body for the past few months preparing for this auction just hit me all at once. And I don't know if this ever happens to any of you, but whether you go to a concert that you've been really excited for, or an event, or something that really excites you and there's been a lot of buildup. The moment it happens and it's over, you almost fall into this depression where you just feel depleted and sad. I liken it to when I studied abroad and I came back home and I had this depression of being back home. I was happy to be back home, but there was this buildup of living overseas and experiencing life over there, and to come back and readjust, just you feel empty. And that's kind of how I felt for the first few days afterwards, which sounds silly, but this was something that meant a lot to me. And I won. I didn't get the Issey Miyake blazer. That one did go for a lot more because that is a very current and relevant designer now. But I got an item that I was the most excited about, and that was her peignoir set. And it just goes to show that I, again, don't read the descriptions, because I thought it was just for the nightgown portion. And it wasn't until after I won that I saw it was for both. The set said set in the description, but I was just tunnel vision. So that was a pleasant surprise, because I obviously don't know how to read. But now comes back to the research aspect of it. I love lingerie. I love vintage lingerie. There aren't a lot of lingerie lines and brands that I don't know about. But Jewel Park, Jeuel Park, was a designer that I honestly had never heard of. And I felt really disappointed in myself that this was one designer that seemed to have eluded me. Now, Jewel Park began sewing and designing her own lingerie in the 1920s during the Depression. And from then until now, the brand is still alive, still making lingerie. She created for a who's who of Hollywood. She created the bridal peignoir set for Grace Kelly. Lana Turner was said to have spent, at the time in the 1950s, $5,000 for one of her lingerie sets. The Gabor sisters, Eva and Zsa Zsa Gabor, of course, Elizabeth Taylor. But the interesting and unique thing about Jewel Park was that she was a bespoke lingerie designer. Everything was custom made to the specific person. There aren't multiples, they're one-offs, which makes it extremely hard to find relevant pieces today, and only deepened her mystery. And I was able to find several resources online, and I'm doing a blog post about this on our archive site that's going to accompany the photos of these items that I won. But I could find photos from her Beverly Hills brick and mortar shop. You can find images, but finding a really detailed background and history to the woman and the brand is very tricky. And like I said, they still make lingerie today, but their Facebook and website and all that haven't been updated since, I think, 2021. So I'm not quite sure where they stand as of now. But I was trying to dive into as much as I could. So in those blog posts, I'll have photos and a little bit more information, and then also the resources I found these at. So this is going to be more of an ongoing research project for me, finding out more about Jewel Park. Because I was able to find a couple of pieces from hers. I believe there's one. Is it in the Metropolitan Museum? I'm not positive, but there was one published lingerie resource where one of her 1940s nightgowns was in. There was this red satin kind of brocade embroidered house robe that's up on a website called First Dibs. But again, it's very sporadic that you can find coherent information and references for this particular line. And again, there are days where I Google this and I don't find anything, and then randomly 2 days later, I'll Google the same thing and I'll find more information that I didn't see before. And what I found the most interesting was that in Elizabeth Taylor's, probably one of her more well-known films, Cat on Hot Tin Roof, based on Tennessee Williams' play, which the play is beautiful, the film is beautiful, you have Paul Newman, Burl Ives, it's such a great movie. But one of the most iconic film stills is when she's in this crisp lace negligee, little slip, and she's changing, having an argument with Brick, played by Paul Newman, who's her husband in the film. And Jewel Park designed that slip. Helen Rose did all of the other wardrobe, but Jewel Park created that slip for Elizabeth Taylor for this particular movie, and it's become an iconic costume in film history. Something so simple, and you see her kind of reliving that again in her Oscar-winning film Butterfield 8, where another iconic scene in the film is her wearing a slip, which that I don't believe was designed by Jewel Park. So I had that to work from. And the more I dug, I found more information about other Jewel Park pieces that went up for auction that belonged to Elizabeth Taylor back in 2013. And they were more peignoir sets and negligees made for Elizabeth Taylor by Jewel Park that were sold by an unnamed personal assistant. And with these, they actually were documented in a film she did called Ash Wednesday. I believe it was released in either 1972 or 1973. A very bizarre film. I was watching it the other night just trying to get reference points for it. It's very bizarre. The premise, I still couldn't tell you a whole lot other than Elizabeth Taylor underwent plastic surgery to make herself look young for her older husband, played by Peter Fonda, and then she gets a younger lover, and it was really bizarre. But she was wearing Jewel Park peignoir sets in that film, and those were the ones that went up for auction. So from what I can deduce, the peignoir sets that were auctioned off in this most current auction, I believe to have come from around the time that she acquired these pieces while filming. And I say that because the tags, the garment tags, which can tell you a lot about the date of a garment, are identical. The script and font is identical, but also the size. Now, Elizabeth Taylor, in her book, True Grit and Glamour, the authorized autobiography, it is well documented that Elizabeth Taylor struggled with weight for various reasons, a lot being health related. So her weight can almost be an indicator of time. And these negligees were very narrow in the waist, slim, petite. She was very short. I believe, what was she, 5'2", 5'3"? Larger bust, but really narrow in the waist, which as you get to the 80s is when she had gained some weight into early 90s and then lost weight again. I mean, I can relate. Same fluctuation, right? So I don't believe that this particular peignoir set was worn in the movie. It could have been a backup one that they may have used in the movie if these others didn't work out, or it could have been pieces that Jewel Park created as a commission from Elizabeth Taylor if she wanted ones made for herself. Because again, they had butterflies on it and flowers and beautiful purple colors. So I believe that during the filming of this, Elizabeth Taylor commissioned Jewel Park to make these pieces specifically for her. And again, this would have been the time where she would have been married and still back and forth with Richard Burton. So my goal is to find the research, seeing if these were for her personal use and not for film. And if they were, was she still with Richard Burton at the time? But that's a fun part of it, is the research and trying to uncover all these stories and the nuance behind it. And that brings me to why pieces like this are so important. You go back to the Elizabethan era. There were no photos. We only had documentation through words and art. And if it weren't for portraits of Queen Elizabeth I, we wouldn't know what she looked like. We wouldn't know the symbolism that she used in her clothing and her garments. Textiles that were used at that time. There's so much that can be pulled from fashion and art that can teach us history. And film history holds up a mirror to what's happening at the time, or what we expect to happen, or it can be a social commentary on what we've experienced. And that's why I feel like film and Hollywood memorabilia fit right into that, especially with Elizabeth Taylor. Now, she wasn't just a movie star, but she was a humanitarian, philanthropist. Because of her, AIDS became something that wasn't taboo. It was a pandemic, and it was killing millions of people. And politics at that time didn't want to touch it. They saw it as a gay disease, a gay virus, and only gay people could get it. And there's so much misinformation about it. I mean, we saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic. But because she had friends that she had known for decades in Hollywood dying from this vicious, vicious virus, she led the charge even when people would turn her down, turning down Elizabeth Taylor. She led the charge, getting millions and millions of dollars. She started up her AIDS Foundation. Got the Reagan administration, who she knew the Reagans back when Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan were in Hollywood. She had an established relationship with them and was persistent and back and forth in finally getting them to recognize AIDS as a humanitarian cause. And we flash forward to now, where we have medicines that they don't cure AIDS, but it's no longer a death sentence if obviously caught early enough. And a lot of that was in large part to Elizabeth Taylor's fight. She worked with Anthony Fauci. That may be a name that you recognize from COVID-19. And she made it her mission to garner as much money and resources as she can to put into this. One of her dearest friends, Rock Hudson, heartthrob of the Hollywood era, starred with her and James Dean in the film Giant, died in his silent battle with AIDS. And she detailed how he wasted away and didn't feel like he could say anything until when he died. And he left everything he had to AIDS research, and how all of this wouldn't help him now, but it would ensure that no one else would have the same fate. And Elizabeth Taylor saw that. She saw many of her friends, those who worked for her, living in silence and dying while people were trying to ignore the fact that this was a real threat and killer. Very, very fascinating. And that was really what fascinated me the most about her, is just how fiercely loyal she was to those around her. And even her kids said sometimes it almost seems like her focus was more on the people around her than sometimes her own family, because she cared that deeply. A really, really fascinating, and again, True Grit and Glamour, Elizabeth Taylor, the biography is really an amazing read. I read it in 3 days. I couldn't put it down. It was really, really good. And this is from someone who's read every biography there is about her. And this was definitely the one where I felt like I got a clear picture of her and things that I never even knew about her before. So I found all of this just really fitting for the fact that these were pieces of hers that I won, and how these connected back to certain periods of her life, but also certain periods in history. And that's where it is significant. It's not just clothing. It's not just fashion. Fashion is art and fashion is history, and that's how we learn. And 100 years from now, that's going to be what's left, if it's well made. But I was really pleased at this last auction, and it was a really great learning lesson for me on just refocusing myself in what I wanted from this auction and why I wanted it. So I'm really excited when I finally can get these pieces. I'm working in the shop on trying to find a better way to display them. My biggest disappointment is that there are a lot of people that come in, mainly people under the age of 40, who read my little placards explaining the Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor bra, and they don't know who the heck they are. That I find to be a damn shame, and one that I hope I can fix. Because these are people that I find highly significant. They were doing all of this amazing work before there was social media, before you had any fame attached to trying to raise money for a cause. They did this under the radar. They did this before they could get any clout for it. And that's where you know it really meant something to them. And it means something to me. There's another auction coming up in November. And I believe it's iconic women in fashion. And they normally don't release any information about what's going to be up until at least a month and a half before the auction starts. The only piece I was able to see that was in this auction was a piece that was worn and owned by Diana Ross. So that's going to be another big one. I don't know if it's going to be a mix of film, music. I don't know who's going to be in it. It just was iconic women in fashion. So it really could be anybody. But I'm excited to see who's in there. Will I be able to bid in that one? I'm not going to hold my breath. But it's still fun to watch and to see what pieces are coming back up for auction. But it was fun. And I love talking to people about it. And when other people take time to ask me about these pieces and learn about them, that's why I do it. These pieces can only live as long as there are people to remember them. And I'm hoping that's what my shop can do, is just keep alive people and items that make an impact and have made our society so much better. We don't hear enough of that. And I want this to be the focus. And I couldn't be more pleased and excited. As I stated earlier, I am going to be putting up photos, descriptions, and information on these past 3 pieces that I won up online, but I'm only going to do it once I actually receive the items. Not for any particular reason, just I want to wait till I actually have them here to put them up on our archive website. But if you haven't already, if you go to our website, carmineandhayworth.com, up at the top right corner, you'll see a tab called the archive. And if you click on it and scroll down, you'll get the option to click and view our digital online archive of the pieces that I've put up so far. Not just Hollywood memorabilia, but Victorian pieces, fabric remnants, cosmetics, vintage Fredericks of Hollywood catalogs. There are a lot of different pieces up there. But pieces from the past 2 Julien's auctions I've been a part of are up online. The most recent one where I have the Debbie Reynolds bra, Elizabeth Taylor's coat, and the beautiful Broadway Erte headdress are currently up there. I have pieces that I won from the auction from the archive of Doris Raymond. Fabulous business owner, collector, my idol in vintage and business for sure. An amazing mannequin from the workshop of Charles James, prolific and iconic designer. So a lot of really cool pieces. So if you're interested in that, head over to the website. You can go click on the archive. If I remember, I will try to put the link to the online archive in the description. I'm going to try to remember, but if I don't, that's how you get to it. But I'm really excited that all of you decided to hang with me during this episode, and I probably rambled. I just get very excited, and I could talk about Elizabeth Taylor all day and my love of her and how I hate the word inspirational, but how she was a woman that made you think. Just made you think about your life and how you treat others. And again, this is my favorite saying. Character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you. And she's someone that I think of immediately. Doing things for others and not expecting something back is really the true revealer of someone's character and who they are as a person. And that's what I find the most fascinating. Again, I thank you all for listening in. And for the entire month of September in downtown Fargo, I will have my Julien's Hollywood memorabilia still up for display. I might take it down and bring it back a different time. I want to find a better way to display them. But at least through September 2023, you'll be able to see them in person and ask questions. And then it'll probably just be by request or private appointment only after that until I can figure out something more permanent. But I hope you enjoy this episode, and hopefully there'll be many more to come. And I thank you. And I hope you have a wonderful, amazing week. And I'll see you next time.